My name is Caroline Duracell-Mellish, and I am the president of the Bibliographical Society of America. And I am really thrilled to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Kelly Wisecup. Dr. Wisecup is a literary, and can everybody hear me okay? Thank you. Dr. Wisecup is a literary and cultural historian who teaches in the English department at the Northwestern University in Chicago. Her research and teaching focus on pre-1900 Native American literatures and textual cultures, history of archives and books, and science and medicine in early America. Her research joins conversations at the crossroads of early American studies and Native American and Indigenous studies, with a particular interest in understanding the relationships between science and colonialism and in the many uses to which Indigenous people put books and manuscripts in the 18th and 19th centuries. Dr. Wisecup's list of publications is impressive. She is the author, editor, and co-editor of 4 books and has authored numerous articles. Her most recent monograph is entitled, as, quote, Assemble for Use, Indigenous Compilation and the Archives of Early Native American Literatures, published by Yale University Press in 2021. And you will hear more about this book during the annual meeting because I am delighted to report it received the 2022 St. Louis Mercantile Library Prize. Dr. Wisecup is an elected lifetime member of the American Antiquarian Society and holds a number of prestigious appointments at various learned societies and journals. She is also a collaborator on a number of grant-funded projects which bring together faculty, students, and Indigenous organizations in Chicago and the Midwest, including the Native American Educational Services College Digital Library Project. That's the one that really has a librarian. No bias here. Her talk is generously sponsored by the Independent Online Booksellers Association. And the title of her talk today is Toward a Bibliography of Birchbark Books. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelly Wisecup.
Hi, everyone. It is such a pleasure to give this talk today and to be able to think through this research with you. I am so delighted. It is also really fun to give this talk in a room full of librarians and staff people from libraries where I have done much of this research. You make this work possible. It literally would not exist without you, so I'm so delighted to be able to say thank you in person and to be able to talk through some of the findings from the work I've been doing in your collections. I also want to thank Caroline, Megan, and Aaron for the invitation and for arranging all of the logistics and so on. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement, noting that we're on the Lenape lands, the lands of the Lenape here, and that I do my work in Chicago on the homelands of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Miami, Menominee, and Ho-Chunk. I'll talk a little bit later in the talk about why that acknowledgement is important and how it matters to the research I do. Before I start, I'm going to make sure I know how to advance slides. Yep, okay, great. So let me get started. In 2016, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians accessioned back into its tribal archives 4 birchbark booklets. They were written by the Potawatomi writer Simon Pokagon in the late 19th century and printed on birchbark between 1893 and about 1904. As the title pages suggest, several booklets describe Potawatomi stories of placemaking. 2 booklets, printed a few months before the opening of the Chicago World's Fair, also known as the Columbian Exposition in 1893, critique the fair's celebration of Columbus's so-called discovery of the Americas and of US progress. The tribe has digitized several booklets, which can be viewed on the tribal archive, and you can see a screenshot of that digital archive here. In a 2018 publication, then tribal archivist Blair Morceau wrote about the booklet's return to the community where the birchbark for their pages was harvested, where the words for their pages were written and printed, and where they were bound with a ribbon and distributed to readers. Morceau wrote, "Making these reverent objects of cultural and historical patrimony available to the community has been a rewarding process. Although the tribe never left Michigan, colonialism continuously seeks to dispossess Indigenous sense of place from the environment, separate Indigenous minds from traditional knowledge, and dismantle traditional kinship structures. Simon Pokagon's books, however, have allowed the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians to reclaim their history, language, and environment in new and constantly evolving ways." Morceau's comment that returning the books to the community allowed the Pokagon Band to reclaim history, language, and environment makes clear that the booklets hold living meaning, and that the booklets hold deep material connections to Potawatomi homelands and communities in both their content and their material form. Pokagon also commented on these relations in the prefatory materials to one of the booklets, noting that his decision to publish on what he called the bark of the white birch tree is out of loyalty to my own people and gratitude to the Great Spirit, who in his wisdom provided for our use for untold generations this most remarkable tree with manifold bark used by us instead of paper, being of greater value to us as it could not be injured by sun or water. The birchbark pages materially demonstrate Pokagon's relations, his loyalty and gratitude to other Potawatomi people, to Potawatomi places and waterways, and to other than human beings. Both Morceau's and Pokagon's descriptions challenge readers to account for the booklets as both printed and birchbark objects. The booklets beautifully demonstrate the relations that Indigenous people make at the level of the page between European forms of literacy and communication tools, here the English language and the printing press, and those tools used by Indigenous peoples going back centuries, here birchbark as a surface for inscription. While Potawatomi people are still making textual and artistic objects out of birchbark, indicating their ongoing knowledge of these material relations, there's a disconnect in the scholarship about the booklets. Most scholars comment on the birchbark pages. They're hard to avoid as an amazing feature of the books. But they don't go much further. The actual story of how Potawatomi people brought print and birchbark together has remained a murky one. Instead, scholars' focus has remained on the booklets as souvenirs of the World's Fair that traded on collectors' desires for tourist art and mementos of Indigenous peoples. And I count myself in this body of scholars. I have a chapter in Assembled for Use that talks about the booklets at the fair and thinks through the ways in which they're revising Washington Irving's history of Columbus. So in part, I'm rethinking my own approach to the booklets, as well as the larger scholarship on it here. This superficial reading, strangely, also applies to the actual content of the booklets, which most scholars have skimmed past. So that's the thing I was trying to take up in the book chapter. I think one reason for this is that Pokagon's publisher, the Michigan lawyer Phineas H. Engel, claimed that Pokagon wrote the booklets as memorials to vanishing Indigenous peoples. And Engel's comments continue to be the most visible in the archives and those most recirculated in scholarly work. It continues to be difficult to see past Engel's reading, even though, as I've learned, it is factually inaccurate. Over the last few years, starting with what I thought would be a fairly straightforward question, who printed Pokagon's birchbark booklets? You can laugh now, as I know you all know it's not a straightforward question. I've been working to investigate the booklets' histories of production and circulation. So tonight, I want to outline a course toward a bibliography of birchbark and a bibliography of the Pokagon Potawatomi birchbark booklets in particular. My investments in bringing bibliographic methods to the birchbark booklets are threefold. One, I'm interested in how bibliographic methods might help us understand Pokagon's experimentation with the forms and relationship between birchbark and print. The birchbark pages, as I've noted, evoke a long history of Indigenous practices of using birchbark as a surface for inscription. And Pokagon brought these practices together with periodical and job printing by printing the booklets on the presses of the Hartford Dayspring, the weekly newspaper near Pokagon's home in Southwest Michigan. So I'm interested here in how bibliography might be more attuned to Indigenous bookmaking as we bring it together with these histories of birchbark making and of bookmaking. 2, bibliographic methods help me locate material evidence of Indigenous people as readers, makers, and users of the booklets. And I'm seeking here to complicate scholarly assumptions that most pre-20th century Indigenous literature was read by white settler audiences. I'm also interested in the people who harvested the birch bark from the trees, split the bark into thin sheets, and then cut those sheets into pages. And I think that bibliographic methods can illuminate how the booklet circulation in the 19th century and beyond was at least in part the result of Potawatomi people's strategic action to place the booklets and their critique of colonialism into particular readers' hands and into repositories of memory. Finally, and most importantly for me, bibliographic research has allowed me to work on research questions of interest to Potawatomi communities and researchers, and it's allowed my scholarship to be in conversation with and of use to members of the Pokagon Band. This is especially important to me because I do my work on Potawatomi homelands, as I mentioned in the land acknowledgement. This talk originated as a research question: who printed Simon Pokagon's Birchbark books? I pursued it in collaboration and consultation with Blair Morso, and then expanded at her invitation to contribute to an edition of Pokagon's booklets, which is forthcoming next year, and that Blair is editing. For me, as a non-native scholar, this priority and method of collaboration are especially important for revising the disciplinary frameworks that often define research exigence and value, and for thinking through how my university and scholarly organizations and their resources can be oriented toward Indigenous communities. I want to also stress that I'm moving toward a bibliography of Birchbark. So toward, because the fact that US printing, copyright, and publication systems privileged editors and authors means that men like Pokagon and his publisher, Phineas H. Ingle, are pretty visible in archival documents. But the many other Potawatomi people who harvested the birch bark and cut it into pages are much less so. So I use toward because the Indigenous peoples, both Potawatomi and from other tribal communities, who owned, read, cared for, and shared copies of the birchbark booklets are a critical part of this story that I'm still investigating. And toward because my talk reflects my contributions to this collaborative effort to produce an edition of the birchbark booklets with Morso and half a dozen other scholars, including library conservators and Pokagon Band language specialists. So toward, because my own participation in this collaboration and my talk tonight represent only one piece of the booklet's stories. So in what follows, I'll sketch this bibliography of the birchbark booklets, and will first give you a brief historical grounding on Pokagon and his community, just to make sure we're all on the same page there. The rest of this talk then proceeds in 3 sections. 1 on birchbark, its harvesting and temporalities. 2 on birchbark bookmaking, and a final section on reading and circulating the booklets, in which I'll discuss 4 copies of the Rebuke or Greeting and their owners. Okay, so let me quickly orient you to who Pokagon is and to some of the histories around the booklets in case they're new to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have in the Q&A around his history. Simon Pokagon lived in what is now Southwest Michigan on Potawatomi lands that the tribal nation still holds. In the 1880s and 90s, he was well known as one of the sons of the Potawatomi leader Leopold Pokagon, a man who was one of the signatories to the 1833 Treaty of Chicago. This treaty was a removal treaty. It sought the removal of all Indigenous peoples, including but not limited to Potawatomi peoples, from their homelands in what is currently Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin to lands west of the Mississippi River. Indeed, some Potawatomi communities were forced in 1838 to move to what was then Indian Territory and now live in what is Kansas and Oklahoma. This map, which is made by Potawatomi Band language specialist Kyle Malott, shows the locations of Potawatomi communities in the Great Lakes both before and after that 1833 treaty. Leopold Pokagon, Simon's father, negotiated sub-articles to the Treaty of 1833 that enabled his community to remain on some of their homelands. The Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, as that community is now called since the restoration of its federal recognition in 1994, spent the years between 1833 and 1896 petitioning the federal government for annuities that had been promised in that 1833 treaty but incompletely paid. Simon Pokagon and other members of the community were well known in Michigan and throughout the Midwest for this diplomacy. I think this is likely how Pokagon and his editor, Cineas H. Ingle, meet each other. Ingle notarized some of the community's testimony for Congress. Finally, today, Pokagon is best known for the booklets that circulated at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The Red Man's Rebuke, a booklet reprinted with the alternate title, The Red Man's Greeting. I want to say just a quick note before going on about Pokagon's use of red man here in these titles. At the turn of the 20th century, several Indigenous writers used this term to claim a position of critique that they framed as inaccessible to white settler audiences. This use of the term by Indigenous writers contrasts its use by settler writers, who used the term to racialize Indigenous nations and in this way to disavow Indigenous sovereignty, and it's seen as a derogatory term in part for that reason today. So to give just two examples of Indigenous writers' use of this term, there's the Mohawk writer E. Pauline Johnson's withering analysis of toxic settler gender politics and marriage in her 1893 short story, A Red Girl's Reasoning, and Dakota writer Charles Eastman's 1904 book, Red Hunters and the Animal People, an account of Dakota traditional stories. So I read Pokagon's use of red man in both the Greeting and Rebuke as participating in this Indigenous literary practice. Okay, with that short background and context in mind, let's now turn to the booklets and their birchbark pages. In deciding to print on birchbark, Pokagon drew on an old and ongoing practice throughout the Great Lakes and beyond of using birchbark as a surface for inscription and design. These include making designs by biting sheets of birchbark. These are the two images on the left here by contemporary birchbark biting artists. These designs are made by folding a sheet of birchbark and then biting it, much as one would make a snowflake by folding a sheet of paper and then cutting designs in it. This history includes as well making quill-worked designs on birchbark, like the image on the far right. Indigenous people also use birchbark as a surface for inscriptions of words or shapes, using birchbark to make messages, boundary markers, and scrolls containing sacred knowledge. This history includes as well using birchbark as a material to make utilitarian objects that are also beautiful, from canoes to baskets. Pokagon himself offered what I think is bibliographic commentary on birchbark in 1898, and so I want to start my bibliography of birchbark there. In an article entitled Indian Native Skill, published in the periodical The Chautauquan, Pokagon criticized settler ethnographers for their gruesome obsession with Indigenous people's bodies and burial grounds, and their fixation with reading such materials to describe what Pokagon called Indigenous people's ancient history. Instead of being obsessed with the past, he suggests, settler scholars ought to look to the things Indigenous people made from birch and ash trees, which would provide insight into what he calls, and I'm quoting him here, what our people are now and what they may become. It's in this context that he described the process of harvesting birchbark. He says, nature has richly provided this peculiar tree with two grades of bark, an inner gray bark which runs with the grain of the wood, and an outer bark, the grain of which runs round the tree at right angles to the inside gray bark. During each year, a layer of thin, tough, paper-like bark is found around the outside of the inner gray bark and under the previous year's bark growth. These sheets, being formed annually, cause the bark in time to become manifold, and as the tree increases in size, they must grow and expand so as to correspond with the increased diameter of the tree. During springtime, the various years' growth of bark can be separated and wound off in a single, double, or triple sheets so as to suit the kind of work desired. For some cause, these sheets of different years' growth vary in hues of red, white, and gold. Pokagon's description lays the foundation for a bibliography of birchbark by pointing to the stages through which bark is harvested and the relation between bark color and season. So let me talk through these stages a little bit with some images. What I want us to see here is not this man, probably dressed for a pageant that took place in northern Michigan in the late 19th, early 20th century, but the trees behind him, where you can see that strips of bark have been harvested. The photo shows how the birch bark used to make objects is the outer bark, and when used correctly, the seasonal growth of the bark will continue, allowing for future harvests. So the first stage is to carefully separate a sheet of birch bark from the tree and wind it off. Then the bark is split into the sheets that Pokagon references. This is an image of the Ojibwe birch bark binding artist and writer Denise Lajimodier peeling birch bark into thin sheets before she makes birch bark binding. And this is not my photo, but I've seen her peel the bark. And if you are very skilled, it is a very quick process. In addition to understanding the practice of stripping and peeling birch bark, Pokagon also directs us to observe the different colors of the bark, noting that darker bark was harvested in winter, lighter bark, harvested in spring or summer, is easier to peel into the thin strips needed for making birch bark bindings or for printing. Pokagon's booklets were printed on birch bark sheets of varying colors, with most of the pages consisting of lighter spring or summer bark and some darker sheets indicating that they're winter bark. Each page is unique, with some pages containing the imprints of burls. And the pages are even unique in their thickness and thinness of the sheets. Each one is really different. The booklets are small. They're about 3x5 to 2x4 inches. They're bound together with a ribbon, worked or sewn through 3 holes punched on the left side of the pages. In the 3 booklets printed after 1893, pages of birch bark have been folded into small folios. For the Rebuke and Greeting, single pages of birch bark have been printed on recto and verso. So as you can see here with the Rauner Library copy of the Rebuke, that's the second from the left, and with the Pokagon Band copy of Algonquin Legends of Paw Paw Lake, so this is the next image, these are the 2 middle images. Some of the darker sheets are used for covers of the booklets, and this is true in a lot of the copies I've been able to consult. So it's possible, I think, that the Potawatomi people harvesting this bark decided that the winter growth bark, being a bit darker and tougher, would be ideal for the title page or cover. It is also possible that winter growth was harvested out of necessity. As this image suggests, birch bark was needed for the booklets as well as for other birch bark objects that Potawatomi people were making to sell or to display at a state of Michigan-sponsored exhibit at the 1893 World's Fair. Potawatomi people were selling birch bark objects to settlers who were increasingly traveling to their homelands as summer tourists. And this was a way to sustain cultural practices and sustain livelihoods as the US and its land cessions meant that Native people had less and less access to the lands that they traditionally had been able to survive and flourish on. So the darker and lighter colors of the birch bark sheets register both seasonal time and Potawatomi people's environmental knowledge of trees and seasons. The annual growth of bark requires knowledge of specific trees from year to year, as well as careful harvesting to ensure that a harvest does not harm the tree, but that the bark will regrow to allow for future harvests. The unique pages of each booklet index the season when it was harvested, and as Pokagon put it, the different year's growth. The color of the pages represents materially the relationships among specific birch bark trees, annual harvests, and Potawatomi people's knowledge of those trees. This temporality, as Pokagon insists, is not one of vanishing or depletion, despite settlers' desire to read in Indigenous art and booklets a mythic past and, by extension, signs of a foreclosed future. Instead, birch bark objects and the skill required to craft them are oriented to recurrent, repeating, seasonal time, indexing an Indigenous present and future that is not organized along linear timelines of progress. So how do we get from harvesting birch bark to make books to printing on birch bark sheets? To understand this part of the story, we need to expand our geographic focus slightly from Potawatomi lands in southern Michigan to a place called Waganakasing in northern Michigan, near what's now called Little Traverse Bay. So the map on your left is made by Kyle Malad. It shows place names in the Potawatomi language for Potawatomi places throughout the Great Lakes. And the blue arrow near the top of the Michigan Peninsula is where Waganakasing is. I've also given you the Google Maps version just so you can see the relation between the two places. Okay, so we're gonna think with Waganakasing in northern Michigan. It's near what's now called Little Traverse Bay. In this next section, I'm going to tell a chapter in this history that understands birchbark bookmaking in relationship to Indigenous geographies and relations across tribal nations. This story involves two Odawa people known to Pokagon and his family, Andrew J. Blackbird and his sister Margaret Boyd, and Boyd is the middle woman in the image on the right. Pokagon and Blackbird were classmates in the 1840s at the Twinsburg Institute in Ohio, and Pokagon made frequent references to Blackbird's history of the Odawa and Chippewa Indians of Michigan, published in 1887, in his own autobiographical novel, Queen of the Woods, which was published posthumously in 1899. In the late 19th century, Blackbird and Boyd were making and selling birchbark objects to tourists who began coming north to Waganakesing during the summers. Boyd, in particular, used objects made from birchbark as what literary scholar Daniel Radis has called an instrument of Odawa advocacy, both in Michigan and on an 1876 diplomatic trip to Washington, D.C. In that 1876 trip, Boyd brought with her petitions to give to President Grant, as well as baskets and a small birchbark canoe, in part as gifts and in part to sell on the way to cover the cost of her train fare. Boyd also used birchbark for bookmaking. She made a book cover out of birchbark and quill-worked designs for a copy of her brother's history. The siblings gifted this book to Georgiana Owen, a member of the Women's National Indian Organization who had assisted Blackbird in editing and publishing the book. Boyd's and Blackbird's birchbark advocacy and bookmaking laid the groundwork for the Rebuke and Greeting by bringing birchbark and the book together, and by indicating how birchbark objects might be put to what Pokagon called domestic use and to the diplomatic uses that Boyd was putting them to. There's also another birchbark book with connections to Waganakesing that was printed in the 1890s and that we have to consider as part of this history. This book was likely influenced by Blackbird's and Boyd's bookmaking, even as it also likely served as a testing ground for printing on birchbark before the Rebuke and Greeting were printed. This is a birchbark booklet entitled Bayview the Beautiful. It's printed in 1892, and it's written by a man named William A. Ingle. He is a Hartford, Michigan physician and an amateur poet, and he is the brother of none other than the booklet's publisher, one Phineas H. Ingle. Bayview the Beautiful is a pretty bad poem praising Waganakesing, which had been recently renamed Bayview by American settlers. The Ingles are traveling to Waganakesing as tourists in the 1880s and 90s, part of an early wave of settlers who were going up there to establish summer homes and to have church meetings on Odawa lands. This is happening even as Odawa people, Blackbird and Boyd among them, were contesting settlers' occupation of lands purchased by Odawa families. It seems, from what I can tell in the documentary evidence, that Phineas Ingle met Blackbird during one of these trips, and Ingle certainly observed the making and selling of birchbark objects before he himself became involved in doing so. Like the Rebuke and Greeting, Bayview is printed on birchbark pages that are about 3 by 5 inches. Copies of Bayview were tied with a ribbon woven through 3 holes punched on the left side of the pages, exactly as the pages of Pokagon's booklets are stitched together. In addition to the engraving of the fan on its title page, Bayview features woodcut illustrations of Little Traverse Bay and other scenes, raising the possibility that the same engraver made the map in the Rebuke and Greeting that's entitled Chicago in My Grandfather's Days. And I know this image is a little tough to see, the one on the right, but it shows the Chicago River coming in from Lake Michigan with Indigenous people in canoes on the water and Indigenous homes across the land there. I think it's also likely that Bayview the Beautiful was printed on the jobbing press of the Hartford Dayspring newspaper. So remember, this is the local newspaper in the town where the Ingles lived and near which Pokagon lived. I have not located the same explicit documentation showing that Bayview was printed on the Dayspring presses that I have for the Rebuke and Greeting, but I think it is most likely that the Dayspring printed the Ingles brothers' birchbark books. The Dayspring printer regularly did print jobs for the brothers in the 1890s, printing ads and notices they placed, as well as one of William Ingle's giant books of poetry. Bayview, Michigan newspapers published only during the summer months. And so I think that working on Bayview would have allowed the Dayspring printer to experiment with the right amount of pressure to use when pressing the birchbark sheets between the type and iron press, perhaps allowing him to feel how durable the thin birchbark pages were and to understand how ink might interact with the birchbark pages, all several months before he printed the Rebuke. In the summer of 1893, newspaper reports have Phineas Ingle selling copies of Bayview alongside the greeting at what is called a bazaar, that's in newspaper reports, at Waganakising. The documentation as to the exact relationship between these two booklets is incomplete as of yet, and so I want to think through a couple of possibilities with you. One might be that Ingle observed Blackbird's and Boyd's birchbark bookmaking and decided to try to print on birchbark, with Pokagon then deciding to build on the interest in Indigenous books and birchbark objects with the Rebuke and Greeting. Another possibility is that it was Pokagon who connected Blackbird, Boyd, and Ingle, and that Pokagon or Boyd initiated the idea to print on birchbark, with William Ingle's poem functioning as a sort of experiment ahead of the Rebuke. Regardless of the sequence of events here, Pokagon's book differs from W.A. Ingle's in several significant ways: in the description of the book's relationship to birchbark and in the book's respective uses, and I'll just briefly outline these. First, both booklets describe birchbark trees along the lakes near Waganakising, but in very different ways. We can compare the two here side by side, and you'll note that each addresses the various objects that Indigenous people make from birchbark, while ending with quite different understandings of settlers and their occupations of Indigenous lands and the consequences of that occupation for Indigenous peoples. And I'll just note here that Pokagon copies lines from several poems in the Rebuke and Greeting. He also copies and revises, but does not cite, part of Washington Irving's History of the Life and Voyages of Columbus. So I'm really unsurprised here by the intertextual resonances between these two booklets. This is very much in Pokagon's mode. So you can see here that William Ingle wrote about the various objects that Indigenous people make out of birchbark, and then turns to describe birchbark trees as lining the shores of Little Traverse Bay. I'm going to read the italicized section of this. He says, "Thanks to the pioneers of that lovely resort who spared from axe and fire a segment of nature's wreath that once decorated the beautiful shore." We can compare this with Pokagon's Greeting and Rebuke, where Pokagon explains his use of birchbark as a material for the booklets and, like Ingle, places it into conversation with the many ways Indigenous peoples use birchbark. He changes the last line of the dedication, however, saying, "Originally the shores of our northern lakes and streams were fringed with it an evergreen, and the white, charmingly contrasted with the green, mirrored from the water, was indeed beautiful. But like the red man, this tree is vanishing from our forests." In this version, Pokagon refused to express gratitude to the people Ingle called pioneers of that lovely resort. Instead, he represented the effects of clear-cutting forests to establish resorts and settler cities and to harvest lumber as affecting both birch trees and Indigenous people alike, linking their experiences of settler colonialism and making clear their interdependence. Printing this criticism in the Rebuke and Greeting alongside his critique of Columbus, Pokagon also tied these local acts of environmental disruption to the history of colonialism across the Americas. The second difference between these two booklets is the respective uses to which they were put. With Bayview the Beautiful, the Ingles began to repackage as curiosities the diplomatic materials that Boyd was making to try to secure Odawa lands for Odawa people. Even as it depends on Indigenous practices of harvesting and making objects with birchbark, Bayview the Beautiful elides the specific material conditions of land acquisition that made possible the resorts where the Ingles were observing this birchbark work. The Ingles' use of birchbark traded on the desires of Michigan settlers to possess objects that evoked Indigenous artistic practices without having to confront the ongoing political status of Indigenous nations, a status that was under threat but still held by both Odawa and Pokagon Band people. I think we can see Ingle's attempt to separate the birchbark books from histories of colonialism and from Indigenous diplomacy as doing the work of what Kevin Brunel has called settler memory, which he defines as a repetitive, persistent process in which Indigenous peoples are woven into the American past and outside the political present. And that's a quote from Brunel. In contrast to these uses, Pokagon utilized the souvenir category as an engine of circulation for the birchbark books, even while complicating that category and its meanings at the same time. For Pokagon, as we know from his 1898 comments, birchbark holds temporalities that exceed the commemorative time of the souvenir and the fading time of settler fantasies of Native peoples. As a result, the Rebuke and Greeting were, and I think still are, in an ambivalent relationship to the souvenir and its promise to commemorate past experiences. The booklets do announce their relationship to the World's Fair on the title pages, and they are explicitly framed as being part of that event. But tracing the booklet's bibliography complicates this reading. There turn out to be several printings of the booklets after the fair, and those reprinted copies, despite still referencing the fair, are not used as souvenirs. So I want to turn in this last section of the talk to the printing history of the Rebuke and Greeting, and then to describe evidence we have for some of their readers, paying particular attention to 4 copies and to where Potawatomi people are in the booklet's travels. As I've mentioned, the Rebuke and Greeting were printed in the spring of 1893, as early as March, when the first notice of the booklets appeared in the Chicago Tribune. A few months later, the Hartford Day Spring reported that the booklets were being printed on its presses across a 10-day period in May 1893. So this timeline might mean that Potawatomi people were harvesting spring and summer bark for the booklets, although I think we also have to consider the possibility that some of the bark had been harvested in previous years and that there was a store that people were drawing on. Several copies of the Rebuke and Greeting share a typeface and layout for the title page, and I think these are from that 1893 printing, that spring printing. The Rebuke was printed first, and then the title page, copyright page, and dedication page reset for the Greeting. Here is some of the evidence that bears this out. In the copies of the Rebuke that share a title page, layout, and typeface with the Greeting, Pokagon's first name is misspelled with an M at the end of the word Simon. The printer reset this page for the Greeting, correcting the spelling error. He reset the dedication page as well, changing some uppercase letters to lower and adding the name of Emma Sickles. She's a collector for the Chicago World's Fair. She's also one of the primary contacts through whom Pokagon and Ingle were circulating the first copies of the Greeting. It was Sickles who arranged for the booklets to travel, but not first to Chicago, as we have assumed, but first to New York City for the New York Press Club Fair. The first Hartford Day Spring article to mention the booklets on May 12, 1893, indicates that the first large order for the booklets came from the New York Press Club Fair, where the booklets were to be part of a so-called Indian exhibit. About 10 days later, the Day Spring noted that Sickles had received the booklets and was placing them for sale at the fair. As this reference to both an exhibit and to Indians suggests, the Greeting was accompanied by about 60 to 100 Potawatomi people in their travels to New York and then Chicago. I haven't been able to identify the names of these peoples yet, but newspaper accounts of the New York Fair indicate that about 60 Potawatomi people were present there. And Dave Beck's careful archival research on the Columbian Exposition has made clear that slightly more Potawatomi people were present in Chicago, employed as what the fair called entertainers. So I think we need to consider these Potawatomi people as potential readers, both of the booklets and of settler purchasers' reactions to them, and to consider that Potawatomi people who had participated in making the booklets may have traveled alongside them. Commentators on the booklets completely erased or ignored these Potawatomi people, reading the Rebuke and Greeting through 19th century settler lenses that associated Indigenous people with nature. One New York paper, in an article reprinted in the Day Spring, described the Greeting as, quote, an Indian book. The paper explained, "It is a beautifully printed volume, not of paper, but of birchbark, a dainty little souvenir entitled Red Man's Greeting." Other newspaper reports called the booklets quaint and a dainty bit of nature, repeating that phrase again. While these notices gloss one set of categories for interpreting the booklets, examining the histories of specific copies and attending to the presence of Potawatomi people shows that these are far from the only ways that the Rebuke and Greeting and their birchbark pages were understood. So let's take a look at these 4 copies that give some sense of that range of interpretation. This copy of the Greeting is likely from the May 1893 printing, and it resides today at Houghton Library at Harvard. It was donated by an alumnus, Samuel Boardman, then president of Maryville College in Tennessee. His accompanying letter indicates one motivation that purchasers had for obtaining the Greeting. Boardman viewed the Greeting as what he called a curious production on birchbark by an Indian chief, and he wrote that he, quote, paid the chief $1 for it, a willing bargain with a fading race. He wrote to the Houghton that the booklet was worthy, it seems to me, of preservation among the treasures of Harvard, in library or museum, which should contain all that relates to our Indian tribes. Boardman sent the copy to Harvard shortly after purchasing it. The arrival date is stamped on one of its pages, September 1893. Acting as a capacity acting in its capacity as a souvenir of the fair, and in Boardman's telling of Indigenous people themselves, the copy of the greeting read in this way is imagined as belonging to an archive where it can be preserved. This reading of the greeting was certainly prevalent in the 1890s, and I think we can see echoes of Ingalls' tourist bazaar here in the understanding of the booklet as souvenir and archival object. And that also echoes in readings from contemporary scholars. A second copy of the greeting, held at the Newberry Library now, adds to this story about the booklet's circulation at the fair. It shows that Boardman's analysis and response are not representative. This copy of the greeting is accompanied by a promotional sheet in which the booklet's title is listed as the Red Man's Rebuke. Rebuke is crossed out and greeting written above. This sheet matches one described by the Chicago journalist and Pokagon, the Chicago journalist and Tribune contributor Teresa Dean. She wrote in a July 23rd, 1893 column, "The other night there came to me a little booklet made from the bark of the white birch tree. On the cover it said, 'The Red Man's Greeting by Chief Pokagon.' In an accompanying circular were the words, 'Red Man's Rebuke,' with the word rebuke crossed with an ink line and greeting written above. I read the little book through before retiring, and somehow its touching words made me understand better than ever before the woes and wrongs of the Indians from their standpoint." Dean then went on to consider the Columbian Exposition through the framework the greeting provides, reading the fair as a celebration of what she calls a discovery that to Native people has been a death knell. Dean's article suggests that Pokagon decided after the printing of the advertisement to send the greeting, not the rebuke, to the World's Fair. And her comment indicates that Pokagon was already sending copies of the booklets to journalists in Chicago ahead of his own visit to the fair in October. Newspapers here become engines of publicity and circulation, as well as printing infrastructures. Dean's comments indicate that if readings like Boardman's view of the greeting as a curious production indexing a fading race were present at the fair, this was only one possible interpretation. Dean's interest in understanding the wrongs of the Indians from their standpoint indicates that the booklets generated alternate, skeptical readings of the fair and its celebrations of Columbus. So, as I've said, the scholarly narrative has it that Pokagon initially began by printing the rebuke and then changed the title to the greeting before sending those copies to Chicago, with the idea being that the latter title was more palatable to possible purchasers at the World's Fair. But the story does not end with that first reprinting. Evidence from Dayspring columns and Pokagon's and Ingalls' correspondence with publishers indicate that it was copies of the Rebuke that were being recirculated, and that it was the Rebuke that was being reprinted as late as 1904, interestingly after Pokagon's death. There are several different title pages for copies of the Rebuke, as you can see here, and it's likely that the Dayspring printers, probably different people, given the frequent turnover of owners at the newspaper, reset the type for these later title pages. In the late 1890s, Pokagon was selling copies of the Rebuke through the philanthropist organization, the Women's National Indian Association, and at least one reprinting of the Rebuke happened for that purpose. The association's periodical, The Indian's Friend, offered the Rebuke for sale alongside the History of the Odawa Nation by Pokagon's friend Andrew J. Blackbird and the Penobscot Abenaki writer Joseph Nicolar's 1893 Life and Traditions of the Red Man. So we might see this as an early instance of how literatures by Indigenous writers started to be marketed as Indigenous literatures. And the NWIA was offering the booklet for sale alongside other birchbark items made by Potawatomi people, including birchbark boxes, placemats, needlebooks, and napkin rings, probably many of the objects in the photographs here, which appear in Pokagon's novel, Queen of the Woods. Sending these materials into circulation along with the Rebuke placed the booklet within a continuum of Potawatomi literature and material culture. This moment reflects how the booklets brought print into relation with birchbark without replacing other long-standing and ongoing uses for birchbark. These items for sale likewise indicate the presence and labor of many Potawatomi people, primarily women, who continue to be involved in harvesting birchbark and making objects for sale. Finally, I'm going to end with a copy of the Rebuke now held at the American Antiquarian Society. There are several names inscribed on the pages, including A.J. Crichton, C.H. Sawyer, and in the Potawatomi language, Ajau Aushkugijik. In sharing images of this copy with Pokagon Band language specialist Kyle Malott, he noted that this word is a man's name, and he translates it into English as wind all across the sky. Malott speculates this may have been Pokagon's name, but he also notes he's not seen such a name for Pokagon before. So we end speculatively. Who inscribed this name into the pages of the Rebuke? A Potawatomi reader who recognized this booklet as part of their historical, environmental, bibliographic, and literary heritage and sought to own it, perhaps before exchanging it with another owner? A settler owner who obtained a booklet from a book dealer, perhaps in a place where he asked a Potawatomi person to translate a name into the pages? I'm still working toward trying to answer these questions, but I think the inscription asks us to remember that Potawatomi people, in addition to being makers of the booklets, were also owners and readers of them. So I want to conclude by returning to Pokagon's comment in his article, Indian Native Skill, that Birchbark indicates what Potawatomi people are now and what they might become, to reflect briefly on the multidimensional temporalities required of a bibliography of Birchbark. If one of the bibliographic features of the Birchbark books is that they combine what we're seeing as ancient surfaces for inscription, Birchbark, with technologies for inscription associated with modernity, the letterpress, Pokagon revises this set of associations to insist on a futurity held in Birchbark. In doing so, he upsets the temporality associated with several bibliographic forms. He marries print's reproducibility with the souvenir's ephemerality, and then combines both with Birchbark's durability and non-reproducibility. Every sheet of Birchbark is different, as I've said, no one page the same as the next, and each more durable than paper. Even if owners, as I think probably happened, discarded their copies of the booklets or donated them to an archive like Boardman, potentially transforming them into artifacts, their materiality insists on longer timescales than the souvenir or booklet or even the archive usually invoke. Add to this the serial reprintings of the Rebuke, no longer oriented to the fair or the anniversary of Columbus's travels in 1492, but continuing to rebuke colonial narratives of Indigenous vanishing. And we can think as well of the Pokagon Band's work to bring copies of the booklets home to the tribal archive, where, far from being artifacts preserved, they are living embodiments of Potawatomi people's histories, homelands, and relations. We might see this as further demonstration at the scale of both the page and the archive of Pokagon's observation that Birchbark demonstrates what Potawatomi people are now and what they might become. Thanks.
So I will stand on this side of the room. Vice President Megan Pizer is going to moderate the discussion. So I will sort of hand mics off, and so will Megan as we move forward.
Halito, I just want to say, Yakoke Chimegwich, thank you so much for that gorgeous talk. And thank you all for being here and learning and listening together. Opening here the floor for questions. I know there will be many. If you'll get your hand up, either Aaron or I will come find you. So, questions.
Do you know approximately how many copies there are with other reprints and so on in institutions? Or?
There are about 30 total. So one of the things I've been trying to do is see them all. And because I started this work in the fall of 2020, I have relied on the generosity of archivists and librarians to share photographs. But I'm going off WorldCat, so those are the ones I know about. I think others must be out there.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a question about the substrate, the birch bark itself.
Yeah.
You've referred to it as being, I don't want to put words in your mouth, stronger than paper or more durable than paper. Can you say any more about that?
Yeah.
Is it acidic, like paper made from trees?
Yes. So partly I'm drawing on Pokagon's own language for this. Partly I'm thinking about the fact that birch bark is used as a material with which to make canoes. And so it's treated with a resin to make it stick together and ensure that it's durable. This is where we get to the piece of the story that the other collaborators in the edition are working on. So 2 library conservators, Marika Kay at the Clements Library at Michigan and Oa Soblom, who worked at the Houghton but is now at another institution, are working particularly on the question of how to preserve birch bark in an archive. So I can refer you to their article forthcoming in the edition for a full discussion of birch bark and its qualities, if that's okay. Thanks.
I've got another sort of logistical question.
Yeah.
So, you raised the possibility passingly about setting up a store of birch bark
Yeah.
to facilitate the printing process.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, to sort of think about that question and the sort of necessity of perhaps doing that. What kind of print runs do we think we're dealing with here? I mean, this is always one of these challenges with sort of quasi-ephemera, is that you have this inverse relationship with survival. I'd just be curious your thoughts.
Yeah. I wish I knew the answer to that question. My archive for this has been the Hartford Dayspring, and so I've just read through as many copies of the 1893 paper as I could. I think there's probably more to find in that paper and when I get to, it's not on newspapers.com or any of the databases, so I got to go to Western Michigan, which I'm excited to do. It does not say anything about press runs. It says a large order. It's hard to, with like going to the New York Press Club Fair, but we don't know what large means. So we do know that the Hartford Dayspring is your kind of standard small town weekly newspaper. It's doing a lot of jobbing work to kind of keep itself afloat. It's not a place where we're doing like a lot of like fast and big jobs. So I'm sorry to only speculate. I totally wish I knew. And if you have thoughts on how to help shape that question in a way that would be more productive. Yeah.
You might have print run numbers for other World's Fair publications.
Yeah.
To get a sense of the scale of some of those jobs, and that might
Yeah.
impact
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Hi, thank you. This is amazing. And I have a question about, you mentioned, Pokagon's relationship to a discussion of Columbus through Irving.
Yeah.
And especially thinking to his close relationship with print. It reminds probably many people of William Apis.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah.
Pokagon's placement of himself in a longer tradition of Indigenous writing.
Yeah.
And also part of that, the role of birchbark itself. You mentioned birchbark as an inscription, but it's also in book bindings as well, yes? And so I'm wondering if there's any discussion in the text of earlier usages of birchbark for bookmaking, either as a writing surface or for things like bindings.
Yeah. Not in Pokagon's text itself. He talks in the slide where I compared with Ingles' preface. Right, so this is sort of his discussion of what birchbark is used to make and to do by Potawatomi people. So he does not discuss its use in other moments in the Red Man's Rebuke or greeting itself. And I think Indian native skill is the only other place in his writings that I've found where he discusses birchbark as a kind of process. I think it's possible there were other periodical writings of his that we haven't looked for and don't know about. So I think it's possible there were other things there. So I want to hold out that possibility. I think he absolutely belongs in a literary tradition that we can take back to William Apis and Indian nullification in 1835, where Apis is pulling extracts from newspapers talking about the so-called nullification crisis, where, sorry to summarize, but just so people know, Mashpee people on Cape Cod had said, the laws of Massachusetts should not apply to us, and we are our own sovereign governing tribal nation. And so Apis is sort of in this fascinating kind of print ecosystem, pulling pieces from newspapers that are covering this controversy and putting it into Indian nullification. That's what you're thinking about, yeah? Just to make sure. Okay. I would also put him into conversation with somebody like Carlos Montezuma. In the 1916 to 1922, Montezuma is publishing a periodical called Wasaja in Chicago. And he is also pulling quotations from other writers, other native people who are writing into the newsletter, as well as the Bureau of Indian Affairs publications. So I think that we could trace this long history of intertextuality in that way. There's also the ways that Pokagon is like rewriting Irving to critique the facts he gets historically incorrect around Columbus's colonization of the Caribbean. And so I think that's also something that Apis is up to. So I hope that helps. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer on the birchbark question, but I'll keep asking.
Hi, Kelly. I could ask you this on the stairwell just as well, but I'll ask it here. You refer to something that was printed in 1892 as a possible test run for, the fair brochures, and you refer to a job press. Do you know anything about the press or presses that were used and how much experimentation was done, and were they all the things, probably done on the same kinds of presses?
It's such a good question. Thank you, Alice, for it. I am speculating here with the informed help of Fritz Swanson, who's a letterpress printer at University of Michigan, who was part of this group that gathered on Zoom in 2020 and the winter of 2021 to talk about the booklets and try to think together about how they might have been produced. So I'm going on Hartford Dayspring newspaper articles that talk in the early 1900s about the arrival of a cylinder press, and some discussion in early 1893 papers of the press they're using. And then working with Fritz, who's speculating there's probably also a small jobbing press that they're using as well. He speculates a Pearl number 3. But there is actually very little explicit discussion of the process of printing the booklets, like the thing we really want them to actually say, they just don't talk about at all. I felt so lucky to actually have them say like, oh, we're actually doing this job right now. But there, as you saw, just very little notices. So that's where I am right now, and hope that we can discover more. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that talk. It was, as many have said, really fabulous. I'm really curious about this object as souvenir.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, one, if you've sort of theorized about, how it operated as a souvenir and the sort of, again, like the theory of the souvenir, but also what other souvenirs were sold alongside with it.
Yeah.
And were they similar in tone? Were they sending a different message? Were they memorializing different points of view? And how does that help us think about this object?
Yes.
Thank you.
There are a couple of things I could say here, and I could talk for a long time about this, so I'll try to be brief. There's so much souvenir ephemera at the 1893 World's Fair, as you may know, and I know many people in this room. I'm gesturing toward Alice again because the Newberry has a large collection of them. And they range from things like maps and photographs to things made specifically for the fair. Pokagon himself, I think, is imagined by the organizers of Chicago Day, this sort of pageant that happens in October, as not necessarily being a souvenir, but functioning much like a souvenir in that he is imagined as commemorating past histories. So the newspaper descriptions of him position him as someone who is a kind of stand-in for his father, and someone who kind of embodies the indigenous past that Chicago was now kind of positioning itself to replace. So I think there's those things happening about Pokagon himself and his kind of embodied presence at the fair. There's some discussion that the booklet was sold on the Midway Plaisance, but I haven't been able to actually, which is the like exotic villages, in quotations, area of the fair, but I haven't actually been able to nail that down. We also do know that copies of the booklets were prepared initially for, and in fact lived in, the State of Michigan exhibit. There's also a kind of local souvenir element of this. And on the return from the New York Press Club Fair, they are sold at William Ingalls drugstore as an item of local interest. So I'm kind of rattling facts, but what I'm trying to sort of get at here is the ways that I think place and occasion intersect with the idea of the souvenir in terms of how people are understanding the booklets, and that differs a little bit depending on where they are and where they're purchasing a copy of the booklet. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much for your questions, y'all. We're going to wrap up here so that we have, I know, there's so much that we could say. I want to make sure that we give one more great thanks. So Kelly, for an amazing talk today.